Hi there, my name is Sarah Jackson Buckley and I am Head of History at Sawston Village College, one of the Trust secondary schools. I'm here though because I am the chair of the Anglian Learning Inclusivising the Curriculum group. And as a group, and I'll explain our kind of aims and ethos in a moment, but we have created a suite of training materials to help you complete something called the diversity audit, which we're really passionate about, and we hope that all of the schools across the Trust will have an opportunity to complete one of these in order to try and diversify our curriculums, but also think about that in the sort of best way that we can, with the most up-to-date theory and influenced by the most up-to-date scholarship about how we should diversify appropriately. So what are we, or who are we? Where does this group come from? Well, there is something in the Trust called the EDI Strategic Group. This group is set up, the EDI part of that stands for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. So the idea of equality is that everybody should have equal opportunities and that there should be no discrimination within our Trust and within our schools. The idea of diversity sort of refers to the idea that we should recognise, respect and value the differences between our pupils, between each other as staff, and also try and reflect those values within our teaching and our curricula. Also, we look at sort of the idea of inclusion, the idea that what we're doing within our schools enables everyone, no matter their background, to feel valued and to feel like they belong within our Trust. So this EDI strategic group was established by the Trust to investigate how as schools we can be more diverse, inclusive, equitable and representative. Now that's really important for head teachers, for example, as employers, to make sure that they are not discriminating against members of staff, but also really importantly for our pupils through our curriculums. The EDI group is mainly made up of senior leaders and Trust leaders, which of course I am not as a head of history, but I am part of a subgroup of the EDI strategic group. And to support the work of the EDI strategic group, a network made up of teachers from a range of schools within the Trust called the Inclusivising the Curriculum Improvement Network come together once every half term and every term to discuss how we are making our curricula diverse within our own schools and more representative. So we come with our own experiences, our own examples from our subject communities and from more wider diversity CPD. The idea is that obviously this is quite a complex field and it enables us to share and pool our understanding of these complex ideas together. So we get to discuss and debate over matters such as how do we decolonise the curriculum? Is that something we should even be doing? And we also get to look at things about like how does gender bias reflect, or how do we see that in our curriculums? And crucially, how can we challenge that? We also look at a wide range of issues. So we're exploring issues of sexuality, gender identity, disability, and the list could go on. We're trying to ensure in some ways that we feel that our curriculums can reflect a wide range of our community, our school community, but also our wider communities in the Trust. So our aims in this group are to identify and share best practice across all the Trust schools and therefore developed a shared strategy and approach to the work that we're doing. Because as I indicated before, it's not always the easiest. So we need to do this in a really, really appropriate way. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an idea of who we are, but it's a bit of a strange phrase, inclusivising the curriculum, and so you might still be feeling a bit uncertain. I'm going to stop talking for a second and let someone else do the talking, and that person is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is a very famous writer, novelist, but she's also very well known for some of her TED Talks, one of which is brilliant and I really recommend watching it. It's We Should All Be Feminists. But this one we're going to play is called The Danger of a Single Story, and hopefully this will show you a little bit of what we mean by inclusivising the curriculum and why we need to do it.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are.
So what do we mean by inclusivizing the curriculum? Well, to take a summary from Adichie, where she says, it saved me from a single story of what books are, what we really want to achieve in Anglian learning is that by inclusivizing the curriculum, we hope to ensure that Adichie's experience is not reflected at our Anglian learning schools. In a nutshell, we want to avoid pupils coming across a single story in our curricula, and we want to ensure that our curriculums provide or reflect multiple perspectives and narratives so that hopefully a wide range of our pupils can see themselves within our curriculum. We are therefore attempting to diversify our curriculum in order to try and ensure that all pupils feel represented, therefore valued and seen within the curriculum. So they feel part of our school communities, they are included in them. And so they can avoid the trapfall of saying, well, where, I can't even imagine myself in these scenarios, or I can't see myself in what I'm learning about. That will give them the connection that hopefully will enable them to feel more valued at school. So why do we need to do this? Well, that is partly it for our own pupils' sense of value. And to be honest, I can't think of anything more important than that. But it's really interesting that 34.4% of school students in England are not white British, but fewer than 1% of candidates for GCSE English Literature in 2019 answered a question on a novel by an author of colour. Broadening the range of available texts is necessary, but also not sufficient to change this. So it's really important that actually our curriculums are more representative of the people that are in front of us. Similarly, this is not just an issue of ethnicity. We know that no more than 7% of candidates for GCSE English Literature in 2019 answered on a full-length novel or play by a woman. So this is also clearly in our curriculums an issue at least at GCSE level, but if we're being frank about it, probably a lot beyond that as well, where people are not being fully represented in the curriculum. Around 50% of our population are women, and then not being reflected equitably in curriculums. Similarly, this kind of problem extends across other diverse groups as well. So this is from a school report from Stonewall, and in this report, they found that when it comes to learning about LGBT people and themes, many pupils report they are completely absent from their curriculum. In a survey of over 3,700 LGBT pupils in Britain's secondary schools in 2017, 2 in 5 LGBT pupils are never taught anything about LGBT matters in school or college. 3 in 4 LGBT pupils have never learned about or discussed bisexuality in school. And 3 in 4 LGBT pupils have never been taught about or discussed gender identity and what trans means. Now, obviously, it's very likely that our pupils will come across these things within, school society, within, social media. They're going to come across these words, and it doesn't mean that they don't know what they are. But the fact that they're not seeing them reflected in our school curriculum is going to have an impact on those pupils who don't feel like they are reflected in what they are learning about. So why does this matter, and why should we care about this? Not just from our pupils' perspectives, but also from a kind of curricular lens. So the Trust has set out a curricular blueprint, which you can access on the Trust website, where they set out ambitions for the curriculum more widely. I'm just going to reflect here how inclusivizing the curriculum not only serves a role from the kind of student angle, the student perspective, but also an important curricular role too, which is something I'm really passionate about. So the first curricular aim of the Trust is to extend pupils' horizons. Well, if we're trying to provide a broad and balanced range of experiences, as the Trust suggests we should, it's really important, therefore, that we are not telling just a single story within our curriculums. We need to, provide a sense of broad experiences within each of our curriculum. Also, to extend our school pupils' horizons, we need to enable our pupils to engage with contemporary matters. Now, a really good example of that is the Black Lives Matter movement. It's talked about in the press, it's talked about in social media. Pupils are going to come across these phrases in their day-to-day lives. But if we can include, and I'm not suggesting we promote, but we include reference to terms like Black Lives Matter, it means that we are enabling pupils to engage with that discourse more widely and come to any kind of discussion about that with more information. We're also thinking about, when thinking about critical thinking, it's really helpful if you have a diverse curriculum, because it enables pupils to approach something by being more informed about alternative viewpoints and experiences. So if they're exposed to seeing topics through lots of different lenses and perspectives, it hopefully will enable them to think critically that someone, they're used to people having different opinions. They might accept that that is something that happens as a matter of fact. It might also enable them to challenge their own preconceptions and biases about the world if we provide them with alternative views of the world. For example, we're very much in this kind of Western mindset. If we provide our pupils with information about kind of native mindsets, for example, it might challenge people's own preconceptions of the world and our place within it. So we're not saying they have to agree with these ideas, but it enables them to think more critically about their own and see alternatives. And finally, the Trust does say in its 15th point that we should be aiming for a diverse and inclusive curriculum. So the purpose of the work we're doing is to try to support staff to have the subject knowledge that they need to explore and express diverse values and ideas. It goes without saying that there is so much work, scholarship, TV stuff, loads of books being published all about diverse issues at the moment. And given how busy we are as members of teaching staff, it is impossible for us to engage with all of them. So what we want to do as a group is try to help you by distilling some of these ideas and information so that you can have access to some knowledge which will enable you to broach these topics in more detail in your classrooms. We also, within that part, want to ensure that staff can develop curricula that recognise and value diversity and difference, and embody provision and respect for those with protected characteristics. And that is part of the direct trust aims. So we want to basically help you to be able to do that, because it's no easy. So really importantly, what could this look like practically? We're going to give you some starting points just to give you a bit of an indication of the kind of ways you could go about inclusivising the curriculum. So the classic thing that people think of when they think of inclusivising the curriculum is something like Black History Month, where we might celebrate the role of different Black people throughout history. So it's something, we might refer to this kind of more generally as a kind of multicultural approach to curriculum, which is one where basically the creator is trying to support or celebrate different cultures. But traditionally, when we think of multiculturalism, it's normally an addition rather than central to curriculum. So by looking at the Black experience within a month, it's not something we're doing every day, but we're celebrating it on this one particular month instead. So a good example of how this might look in reality is a Black History Month display, and in that same month you might do an assembly. Who knows, you might even do a special lesson. It's celebratory, therefore it often celebrates the roles of people within these diverse communities and what they have brought to society, usually in the face of lots of conflict. But the key bit is it's supplementary. It's not running central throughout our curriculum. It's kind of on the surface, or kind of separated to one side, we could say. But there are some significant dangers with doing inclusivising the curriculum in this way, or making our curriculums more diverse in this way. So the first danger of this, as Sathnam Sanghera explores in his book Empire Land, which I really encourage you to read, is tokenism. If we just approach this in a multicultural way, there are significant and damaging risks that you might be potentially unwittingly enacting. Now, obviously, whatever we do in this way has got really, really good aims and ambitions, and I don't want to suggest for a moment that anybody who's doing a Black History Month display is trying to do something bad. It's often, you know, the work of someone who's really passionate about trying to promote these issues within school. But the problem is, by focusing celebratory attention on non-dominant groups outside the context of the rest of the curriculum, the teacher in their own way is further defining these groups as different, the other. They should be treated differently. They get a special month because it's almost like they're not worthy of attention elsewhere. The problem with that is our pupils may learn to consider the struggles of non-dominant groups as kind of extra, additional information that's just a nice addition, rather than important knowledge in their overall understandings of the world. And by celebrating multiculturalism, therefore, we might actually overlook some of the things that really should be explored in more detail. Often the examples looked at, like Martin Luther King, classic addition in Black History Month, is someone who was facing a lot of segregation and racism in America in the 1960s. But actually, by not exploring the wider context of his experiences, we're ignoring dealing with some difficult and important issues of race in America, for example. Similarly, if we're looking at the empire and we're thinking about examples of people from the empire who perhaps, you know, challenged imperial rule, for example, Gandhi, we only celebrate his role. We might not look at the wider picture of colonialism and explore those kind of really necessary issues of empire in a meaningful and impactful way. So while this work is really important and it's a good starting point, and I think really when it was created, Black History Month was created because there was no Black history going on in schools, or more widely, not celebrated more widely in kind of wider community. Obviously it did exist within particular groups. But now we need to really go further than that to make sure we're not continuing this idea of the othering process. The other thing to say is that sometimes we can create a sense of binary rather than blended curriculums if we are not careful with multiculturalism. So, for example, if we're a teacher who decides they want to make their curriculum more diverse and more inclusive, we could go about it, and I have seen this done many times, by including a unit on Black poetry, for example, or Black Tudors, or Black composers if we're a music teacher. We are, therefore, fulfilling the role of making our curriculum more diverse by including this. And this is great because it's actually happening in lessons. It's not just a one-off per month or one-off month in a year. But the problem is, I would never ever go about labelling a unit White Tudors. So why would I want to make clear to my pupils that this is a group who are entirely Black? By forefronting that, we're making it clear that this group have something different about them to the people in the rest of our curriculums. It's highlighting that they are different. It's making them the other. And it's creating a binary between them and the other people that we study in our curriculum. So if we clearly mark these groups out as different in these units, they may not be fully appreciated by our pupils as they are not expressed in the same way as white Eurocentric narratives. So we're not writing titles for units in the same way that we are for other groups. And so therefore, it's perhaps implying that they are different somehow. We are therefore marginalising groups by pushing them forward really in this way. I would also say that often when you do this kind of work and really label it as a kind of, you know, the title of your unit is this kind of clearly about a diverse group, you might be seen as being quite political. And there's therefore much more likely to be pushback from parents and pupils themselves who might feel that there's a bit of a political agenda behind the work you're doing. Now, frankly, it might not be political at all. For example, in the history curriculum, there's a book called Black Tudors by Miranda Kaufman, and that's really widely celebrated as a really good academic book. I might not be trying to promote a political agenda, but frankly, just doing great history by looking at the Black Tudors through the eyes of Miranda Kaufman. But if we do label it in this way, we're opening ourselves up to potential criticisms. We're opening ourselves up to this kind of notion that we're just trying to correct the issues and compensate for the lack of diversity within the rest of our curriculums. A third issue with that particular approach is that you might end up viewing these diverse groups or enabling our pupils only to view these diverse groups through very traditional lenses. And what I mean by that is really only enabling our pupils to see these groups through as victims. So traditionally, many diverse groups only feature in curriculums when they're involved in protests or campaigns against discrimination. So a traditional example from the history curriculum, as I am a history teacher, is the Votes for Women campaign, often taught in schools. This is when the traditional story of the suffragettes and the suffragists who fought for women's right to vote. But the problem with if we only come across women in that particular unit, as it frames women and their contributions in purely traditional terms. Women in that unit come from a position of weakness, and it's their struggle, despite that weakness, that enables them to achieve. Similarly, when we focus on the accomplishments of a few heroic characters, for example, we might focus on the work of Dr. Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, we focus on these people who face adversity, huge adversity normally, and, for example, in his particular case, horrific racism. The problem is these people are heroes not because of their, day-to-day human accomplishments, but because they were able to overcome something, because they were a victim who was kind of able to overturn the tables. The problem with that is we are therefore narrowing the encounters with these groups into situations where these people are only victims, and we only look at them when they've overcome these weaknesses or these problems that they faced. Actually, it would be more interesting from a history point of view, for example, to look at women's rights in medieval Britain, when actually women had quite a lot of significant rights and more rights than they did in Victorian times. That would be a real way of challenging misconceptions that women have always been treated really badly, always done the housework, etc. We could explore women's accomplishments on their own terms, because that's what medieval women could do, rather than their experience just as victims in the Victorian times, for example. So instead, when we look at these groups, we should focus on their real experiences of these non-dominant groups in a range of situations. So not just as victims, but their experiences throughout time, throughout society, because we are just hammering home a kind of narrative that these groups have been treated badly throughout history, and it's just a modern day phenomenon that we're trying to create more equality. If we explore these groups before their experiences of suffering, so for example, we could look at the pre-colonial experiences of medieval Africa, where actually, Mansa Musa, one of the richest men ever to have lived, was around. We could see that actually medieval Africa was a strong powerhouse. And so, people of black ethnicity are not always those from a weak position. So we need to challenge these misconceptions rather than embed the conception that, diverse groups have always been targets and always been victims. So we're going to talk about this as a progression model, and I'm sure you've heard that phrase before, and it's quite, maybe quite annoying, but we're going to think about a progression model in this way. What do we mean by an inclusive curriculum progression model? So if we're starting, this is an example from an article in Teaching History. Again, sorry for my use of history all the time, but it's just what I know, and I can't talk to you in loads of detail about what I don't know. I have to be honest about that. But this is an example of women in the history curriculum. If we've got quite, we've just started on our curriculum improvements, we might want to include the study of a few great women who maybe overcame adversity. We then might start including a unit on medieval women, for example. We're treating women as distinct in their own unit as a different group. We might then start to look at them in contributory terms. So what I mean by that is like the role they played within something more widely. So if we were looking at the working class movements of the 19th century, we might look at the role of women within that. We might then move to this sort of model where we start to become more corrective and compensatory. So, we've looked at men in this unit, therefore we're going to make sure we look at women as well. We then might start using women's history as a challenge to preconceptions, like I mentioned before, including the unit on medieval women, so that we challenge preconceptions that women have always been, people that suffered. But then, if we're really, really trying to integrate our curriculum, we might do something called relational history, where we look at the relations between different groups. And even better than that, integrated history, where different groups are considered at different times, all in the same way, wherever possible, to ensure that it's all integrated and not one group is being treated differently to another. So that is the model we're going to aspire to. It's not easy, but we